Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. I think the title of my presentation probably speaks for itself. If you could cast your minds back to early last year, there was a proposal from government to commemorate the RIC, and the reaction to that, certainly in some quarters, was quite contentious and divisive, so much so that the proposal was put to bed, and I'm not sure if it will ever be resurrected. But in view of that reaction to the proposal, I think it's worth examining the Royal Irish Constabulary, its history, why and when it was brought into place, what impact did it have on rural Ireland, because it was a rural police force, and was it accepted by the populace in Ireland. It was established in the mid-1830s during quite a turbulent period in Irish history, particularly in rural Irish history, oppressed by a minority regime and in the main destitute due to adverse landlordism. Many of the native Irish peasantry responded aggressively against landlords and also engaged in general lawlessness. It's not moving for me, I'm afraid. Okay. This is the kind of general state of play in rural Ireland during that period, in the mid 30s, and on the column on the left is the lawlessness. The agrarian lawlessness was mainly being perpetrated by what were known as the agrarian secret societies, ribbonism, or what the authorities collectively referred to as the banditti. And the banditti targeted landlords, or more often the landlord's agents and the landlord's property, in efforts to persuade the landlord to grant concessions to their tenants. The banditti were also caused quite a lot of intimidation within their own communities, as they demanded protection and demanded funding, and they could sometimes deal quite brutally with those who would not cooperate with them. Communal crime was spiraling out of control. The native peasantry had, or most of them had certainly rejected the existing policing and judicial systems that were there, and not without reason. But they had instead resorted to what is called communal law, a quite brutal alternative based on vengeance. The killing of 8 people here in County Louth in 1816 during the vengeful attack on the Wild Goose Lodge is a good example of communal law at its extreme. It was tit for tat, an eye for an eye, and violence begot violence. Faction fights, this is real gangs of New York stuff. This would quite often involve hundreds on either side, meeting up on a designated day, usually market days. And the authorities tended to ignore these fights, being of the opinion that as long as they fought amongst themselves, they were no threat to anybody else. But they had to be quite a terrifying experience for any innocent bystanders. Sectarianism, or sectarian violence, was mainly contained within Ulster, as provocative Orange Order demonstrations led to quite violent clashes with Catholic communities. On the other side of the fence, we had local governance under the magistracy, the local magistrates. The magistracy was a British institution that was never really going to work in Ireland. And besides the historic and religious differences, within Ireland itself, the pool from which magistrates could be appointed was quite small, and at times of quite poor quality. So many of the magistrates, at best, I think, were probably inept. At worst, they were corrupt. And in fact, many of them were somewhere in the middle, more intent on protecting the ascendancy, rather than properly maintaining law and order or dispensing justice. The military had, or the underneath the magistrate and under their control, and very much under their control, including the hiring and firing, was the county constabulary, a force that was established in 1822. It was almost 70% Protestant in a country that was 80% Catholic. So the native peasantry mainly looked at it as simply another tool of oppression to be used by the ascendancy. The militia or the military had been in serious decline from the time of the prolonged Napoleonic Wars and the economic downturn that followed, and more recently, social unrest in Britain due to the advent of industrialization had put further pressure on the military. It had reduced from about 50,000 at the turn of the century to less than 30,000. The militia were generally raised by the magistracy as and when they were needed. The most notorious of these would have been the ultra-Protestant yeomanry, which gained a bloody notoriety during the 1798 rebellion, and more recently during the so-called Tide Wars of the 1830s. It was finally disbanded in 1834. Dublin Castle had long recognised that there were serious shortcomings and serious failings in local governance, and had attempted over quite a few years to introduce reform. But these attempts had been strongly opposed by the magistrates, and at times very much supported by the House of Lords. Things were to change. In 1836, Sir Thomas Drummond had two acts passed through Parliament, one of which was to radically change how rural Ireland was policed. The first act was the Dublin Police Act of 1836, which established the Dublin Metropolitan Police, or the DMP, a force that remained in situ more or less unchanged until it was subsumed into An Garda Síochána as late as 1925. The second act was the Constabulary Ireland Act of 1836, and this established the Irish Constabulary. It was some 30 years before it got its royal prefix. Drummond was very sympathetic towards the plight of the Irish peasantry and was not impressed by landlordism, by the gentry, or by the magistracy, and he made no secret about this. So he did introduce some radical changes. Probably the main one in the new constabulary was that he removed, or the act removed, all influence of magistrates over policing in rural Ireland at the stroke of a pen. The new constabulary was centrally based, headquartered in Dublin Castle under an Inspector General, with a chain of command down to a local district inspector. He would have been the equivalent of a modern-day Garda superintendent. The Act also put in place as a system whereby qualified barristers were, over a period of time, appointed as resident magistrates in rural Ireland, and gradually these resident magistrates displaced the old politically appointed magistrates, and that was quite a big move. Drummond insisted that access to positions within the new constabulary at all levels would be open to Catholics, and he had to vigorously defend this at a parliamentary committee meeting in 1838. But the upshot of that policy was that eventually the force became 80% Catholic, mainly at rank and file level, although there was a Catholic Inspector General at one stage, and I'll be touching on him later. So who were the men? Sorry, I'm going backward. Two totally different classes of men within the RIC, the rank and file, or the enlisted men on the left here, and the officers on the right. The enlisted men needed to have a basic primary education, and they had to sit an entrance exam, which was based more or less on the 3 hours. A vast majority of the enlisted men, right throughout the life of the constabulary, were from farming background, 70% of them on average. They went through a 6-month extensive training course before they were dispatched out to barracks throughout the country. The officers were a completely different class. And the entrance exam for cadets was quite extensive. So they were highly educated. The majority of them were educated to university level, and they came from wealthy backgrounds. As a consequence of this, when they were appointed throughout rural Ireland, they tended to mix with their peers, which was the local gentry. So even though Drummond had removed the influence of the magistrates and by extension the gentry from over the new constabulary, they would at least have had a sympathetic ear within the officers on the force. The military officers were much the same. They also tended to mix with the local gentry. There would have been quite a cozy relationship between the police officers, the military officers, and the gentry, and I'll give an example of that later. In that first year, 7,500 men were dispatched to 1,400 barracks, with a minimum of a sergeant and 3 constables in each barracks. The barracks were generally no more than 5 miles apart, so these men were put right into the community, and certainly the background, the farming background of the enlisted men would have been very useful in this case. The force does seem to have been generally accepted. There's no evidence that there was any animosity against the new constabulary. Any objections seem to come from the Protestant community and the ascendancy, and this may be because the establishment of the force followed hot on the heels of Catholic emancipation. At Drummond's insistence, some of the first actions taken by the constabulary were to put an end to faction fighting and the Orange Order demonstration, and they were quite successful in this. These are the earliest statistics I could find for the new constabulary. They cover quite a long period from 1841 to 67, and this shows that the constabulary certainly kept the minor courts very busy with cases. There was a slight dip, or a substantial dip, I suppose, at the beginning of the famine, but other than that, it's fairly constant. Probably overall, it's increasing, and in this graph, it peaks in the final year 1867. But it does show that they were certainly keeping the courts very busy. In more serious offences, what are called outrages, they were certainly making inroads into putting an end to this, to these outrages. There was an understandable peak during the famine years, but other than that, they seem to gradually decline, so that in 1867, the figures are very much less than half of what they were in 1841. In agricultural outrages, it was much the same, maybe even more dramatic. For instance, the theft of farm animals, sheep and cattle, declined from a high of over 15,000 in 1847 to less than 1,000 in 1867. That's quite a dramatic drop in those crimes. 1867, by the way, was the year of the Fenian Rising, organized by the recently formed Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB. The constabulary had infiltrated the IRB through informants, and when the rising took off in about a dozen different locations around the country, it was very quickly put down by the constabulary. And for their efforts, or the success in quelling that rising, Queen Victoria awarded the force, or bestowed the royal prefix on the constabulary, and it's only from then on that it became the Royal Irish Constabulary, or the RIC. I'm not going to cover the period of the famine. I think that would be a presentation on its own. But post-famine events heralded further deteriorating circumstances for tenants. The mortgaged estates of bankrupt landlords were forcibly put up for sale under the Encumbered Estates Act of 1849. These were landlords who received no rental income during the famine. Most landlords didn't, but it was particularly hard on landlords who had mortgaged their estates. So they were forced to put these estates on the market to clear their debts. The Westminster's reasoning behind this was that the estates would be purchased by investors who would develop an agricultural industry which would employ the masses. It never happened that way. In fact, many of the estates were purchased by relatives of the encumbered or the bankrupt landlords. But what did happen was that as the estates changed hands, and about 5 million acres changed hands, the sitting tenants lost whatever rights they had, and there were mass evictions as land was cleared for the more profitable grazing and the less labor-intensive grazing business. The police reckon that between 1849 and 1854, 250,000 tenants were forcibly ejected from their holdings. The evictions, they were sordid operations, usually associated with adverse landlordism, but they were legal. And because it was a legal process, the RIC was obliged to attend and to provide protection for the sheriff and his men. The sheriff's men were generally referred to as the emergency men. This would have been outsiders who were brought in to execute the evictions. There is a belief that the constabulary actively engaged in the eviction processes, including the removal of the tenants and the destruction of the properties. In fact, the instructions to the police were quite explicit, and these were instructions in their own manual. They were not to take any hand, act, or part in the eviction process. And I have to read this. They were only to act if the sheriff or his men were assaulted or threatened with assault, or if there was a violent resistance, in which case they were bound to arrest those responsible, and if necessary, to force entry to buildings in order to arrest those. The constabulary policy was to attend in strength of numbers, which generally meant that there was no aggravation or no violence, and the evictions passed off peaceably, for want of a better word, of little consolation for the unfortunate evictees. Evictions continued over the following 50 years, increasing as tenants became more organized, and Parnell's plan of campaign, which included the mass withholding of rents, resulted in a large number of convictions, so much so that the Inspector General of the RIC issued an instruction that evictions in districts or on estates were to be arranged to accommodate the availability of both the constabulary and the military. And what this meant was that evictions became organized events, maybe lasting a week or longer, and for which hundreds of constabulary and military would be provided. This is an example of one of them. This is the photograph at the Vandeleur estate in County Clare in 1888. It's called here the Vandeleur evictions. I've also seen it referred to as the eviction party. And it wasn't a celebratory party. It's a party of men that have been brought together to organize the security for upcoming evictions on the Vandeleur estate, and also to oversee the evictions. Included in that group are, and I talked earlier about the cozy relationship between the military, police, and the landlords. Included in this photograph are 5 RIC officers. There are 8 military officers, 3 resident magistrates, and the landlord's agent. The landlord was an absentee agent. So it's hardly what, and the photograph was taken on the front steps of the landlord's stately home in County Clare. It can hardly be described as an impartial lot. The tenants really had no hope. What was planned for the Vandeleur estate were 21 evictions, and for this the sheriff brought in, or was bringing in, 20 men. So that would be 21 men would need protection. And for this, it was decided that 250 constabulary, a troop of hussars, and 2 companies of soldiers would be required. That is certainly attending in strength. Fortunately, at this period, landlordism was coming to an end. Many were bankrupt for many reasons, but mainly due to total mismanagement of their estates. And a series of land acts had been passed to facilitate the transfer of land through the Land Commission from the bankrupt landlords to the tenants. The most important of these acts would have been the so-called Wyndham Act of 1903, which provided cheap mortgages for the tenants to purchase their estates. over 11 million acres of land changed hands from the landlords to the tenants over quite a short period. It was a seismic change in rural Ireland, and it brought an end almost completely to agrarian aggression and agrarian outrages. The constabulary had already very much got the communal crime and communal outrages under control. So there was a calmness and a peace descended upon rural Ireland. It was also helped by improved social structures, by better education, a cultural revival. Militant nationalism had taken a backseat to constitutional nationalism in the shape of Home Rule, being driven by John Redmond's Irish Party. Sinn Féin emerged during this period as an alternative nationalist movement with a policy of passive resistance to British rule in Ireland. The RIC became a civic police force. They hung up their weapons, they put them away. In the year 1900, they had been issued with 11,000 up-to-date rifles. In the year 1912, the Inspector General received a report to the effect that the training of the force in the use of weapons was only rudimentary. The elephant in the room was Home Rule. And when the Home Rule Bill finally made its way through Parliament and became a Home Rule Act, the Unionists reacted angrily, and this resulted in the forming of the anti-Home Rule Ulster Volunteer Force, a paramilitary force, and then the consequential pro-Home Rule Irish National Volunteers. The Constabulary closely monitored these two organisations as they rapidly grew in numbers and as they acquired weaponry. The Inspector General commented one time that the INV was growing so rapidly that it would soon be able to dictate the law of the land. Civil war was threatened for a while, but the Great War intervened. The Home Rule Act was parked pending the outcome of the war. Many within the UVF enlisted in Britain's war effort, so the threat from that organisation dissipated. John Redmond had taken over control of the Irish National Volunteers, and since he and his party supported Britain's war effort, there was no threat from the INV. The breakaway Republican-minded Irish volunteers, about 1,100 men, was viewed by the authorities, including the RIC, as a nuisance rather than a threat. The nuisance element being its campaign against enlisting. Otherwise, the Irish volunteers, were never going to pose any danger. They were, this is the police view, they were totally disorganized and possessed little or no weaponry. So when 1916, the rising in 1916 occurred, many people, including the RIC, were caught on the hop. They were surprised. And I'm sure quite a lot of men, like these four men here, who marched out on Easter Monday morning, were probably also caught on the hop and were surprised at what they were marching into. I'm not going to dwell on the rising, it's been well trashed out in recent years, but I'd like to focus on one incident during the rising which demonstrates how ill-prepared the RIC were for armed conflict, for armed confrontation. And this is the so-called Battle of Ashburn, or sometimes referred to as the Ashburn ambush, incorrectly. It was not an ambush. About 50 rebels were operating in North County Dublin, in the Fingal district, during the week of the rising. They were under the command of Thomas Ashe and Richard Mulcahy, and they were the most successful of the rebel groupings anywhere in the country during that week. They had successfully attacked 4 RIC barracks in the district, and on the Friday, they laid siege to a barracks just north of Ashburn, very close to Kilmoon Cross. And while they were there, a motorised convoy of almost 60 RIC arrived on the scene from the direction of Slane. And they were under command of a County Inspector Gray, a man who had a reputation of being a bit of a gung-ho character. The police were delivered right to the point of battle, a bit recklessly delivered to that point. and in the ensuing gunfight, County Inspector Gray and a district inspector and 6 other RIC men were killed, as were 2 volunteers. But incredibly, the remaining RIC men, including those in the besieged barracks, over 60 men, supposedly highly trained, disciplined, and well-armed men, they surrendered to a bunch of poorly trained and poorly armed rebels. It certainly showed up the RIC for where it was at that stage. It was a civic police force. It was not prepared for any kind of military or armed activity. Immediately after the rising, the incumbent Inspector General, a man called Neville Chamberlain, no relation to the future Prime Minister of Britain, he was forced to resign, and he was replaced by a man called Joseph Byrne, who was a Catholic, the first and only Catholic Inspector General. Despite the management change, nothing was done to remedy what would seem to have been an obvious shortcoming in the constabulary, and this is weapons training, or lack of it. And even as extreme nationalism took a strong foothold in Ireland throughout 1917 and 1918, nothing was done to retrain them and to upskill them. This would have been fine if the constabulary was to be left merely as a police force, but when the War of Independence developed, 2 things put the force in the line of fire. The first was that Westminster decided that the RIC should be in the front line against what was now to be called the IRA. The military was there to assist the police, and even as the War of Independence developed, more and more military was poured into the country, but only to assist the RIC. The probable reason for this was that Britain, if they sent in the military directly against the IRA, it would have been an admission that there was a war footing within the UK itself. So the RIC remained as the front line, a position for which it was certainly not competent. The second thing that went against the RIC was that Dáil Éireann marked out the RIC as legitimate targets. In April 1919, Eamon de Valera addressed the second sitting of Dáil Éireann, and in a debate he called for the ostracization or the boycotting of the RIC. And in the same debate, Owen MacNeill referred to the RIC as a force of traitors and perjurers. They were neither. In fact, another man described them as being by and large honest and decent men. But the RIC was the tangible face of colonialism or of British rule in Ireland. And if the effectiveness of the police and of the judicial institution, which was also being targeted, if they could be negated, then there would be anarchy, which is what Dáil Éireann and Sinn Féin would have wanted. Where the boycotting took off, chiefly in Munster and Connacht, it quickly developed into intimidation and into violence and into the killing of policemen, and the constabulary went into siege mode. Isolated barracks were evacuated and subsequently destroyed by the IRA. Normal policing became impossible. Patrols could only take place if accompanied by the military. The attacks on barracks escalated, though largely unsuccessful, but they would certainly have unnerved the police, as would the killing of 11 policemen during 1919 and a further 10 in the first quarter of 1920. And due to retirements, resignations, and a lack of enlistment, the strength of the force fell to around about 8,000 in the spring of 1920. In January 1920, Joseph Byrne, the Inspector General, was dramatically dismissed. No reason was given, but media speculation is that he was dismissed because he was opposed to the militarizing of the RIC, and certainly militarizing was on the cards at that stage. General Henry Tudor had been appointed to Dublin Castle as a police advisor. He was eventually to appoint himself as Chief of Police, but he was certainly in favour of militarizing the force, as was his friend Winston Churchill, who was then the Minister for War. Reinforcements began to arrive from Britain in March 1920. They were called reserve constables or temporary constables. They became known in Ireland as the Black and Tans because of the colour of their hybrid uniform. They were recruited mainly from demobilised soldiers of the British Armed Forces, men that were not long removed from French warfare in Europe. They were not fit for purpose. District Inspector in Dundalk referred to them at one stage as uncontrollable savages. They were not policemen, they were not trained as policemen. They did receive a perfunctory 3-week so-called training in Beggar's Bush. It was more of a familiarization course before they were sent out to their different barracks around the country. They were undisciplined. They were generally insulting towards the members of the Irish public. Apparently, they put sugar on their porridge. They got involved in petty crime. They got involved in assaults on members of the public, and they were involved in some murders. Their raison d'etre became counterproductive as their activities simply generated more and more support for the IRA. In August, a second batch of temporary reinforcements began to arrive, and this was the Auxiliary Division of the RIC, or the Auxiliaries. These men were certainly fit for purpose. They were recruited mainly from demobilized officers of the British Armed Forces, heavily armed and very mobile. Although they were attached to the RIC, they were unbound by the RIC rules and regulations. They operated independently, outside the law, above the law, and as well, I'll come to sometimes quite brutally. Their agenda was to wipe out the IRA, or in the words of a RIC division commissioner in Munster, to wipe out Sinn Féin. At its height, there were 17 companies of about 100 men operating in Ireland. Within weeks of them first arriving in Ireland, a company based in Dublin surrounded an IRA training camp in the Dublin Mountains, killed one IRA man, captured 40 others, and seized a large amount of weaponry and ammunition. It was an operation carried out with military precision and stealth. It was a huge success, and it certainly would have got the message across to the IRA that the ante was being upped. They had to have been operating on RIC intelligence at that stage, because they hadn't been long enough in the country to have gathered that information themselves. And probably still operating on IRA intelligence, they continued with a string of further successes against the IRA, and many IRA were arrested and put in prison. Many others were killed. The IRA began to fight back, and possibly the intelligence that they were receiving began to dry up. They weren't really keeping in touch with the RIC too much. They preferred to operate independently, and they had nobody on the ground. But they seemed to have got frustrated at some stage, and they began to engage in reprisals. This would be following attacks on the police. They would carry out attacks on homes, on businesses, on industries. Creameries were a favourite target of theirs, and these would have been the economic mainstay of many communities. Many towns were shot up, others were destroyed, such as Balbriggan, and there was also the orgy of destruction carried out in Cork City in 1920, when over 300 homes and businesses were destroyed. Prisoners were shot, allegedly escaping, and I think something like 47 prisoners in total were shot whilst allegedly escaping from police custody. Men were removed, taken from their homes late at night and executed, including 6 men here in County Louth. 2 priests were executed by the Auxiliaries, 1 in Galway and 1 in Cork. And then there was the absolutely brutal and barbaric torture and murder of the Loughnane brothers in Galway. The Auxiliaries were out of control. In November 1920, the Prime Minister Lord George announced to Parliament that we have murder by the throat. He was wrong. He was certainly premature at that stage, because the IRA was still capable of operating and carried a number of quite successful operations against the Auxiliaries. But as 1921 progressed, and certainly as the summer of 91 progressed or approached, the IRA was in trouble. Hundreds of the members were in jail. Most of the rest were on the run and trying to fight the War of Independence while on the run, and they were extremely short of weaponry. The worldwide public opinion was focusing on the activities of the Auxiliaries, and people were horrified, including the public in Britain. They were appalled what was happening, and pressure was put, particularly from the US, on Britain, on the British administration, to settle the Irish question. And I think this would certainly have added to the pressure on Lloyd George to negotiate a truce. Truce negotiations began, and a truce was called in July 1921. The treaty was signed in December, which brought an end to hostilities. Part of the treaty was that the RIC would be disbanded, and this happened over March and April 1922. Every man that was disbanded was paid a pension, or was given a pension payable immediately, including the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries. There were very generous pensions. 12 years were added for every man. So a member of the Auxiliaries who had maybe done less than a year in Ireland would have got a 12 years of pension, which equated to about £50 a year. The fact that these men were given pensions gives them a certain legitimacy and gives them a certain permanency, if however brief, within the RIC. Just very quickly, some casualties. The column on the left it's interesting that in the first 15 months of the War of Independence, 21 RIC men were killed. In the following 15 months, which was when the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries had been drafted in, a further 391 RIC men were killed, including about 175 Auxiliaries. On the right, the total fatalities for the War of Independence, I can only see some of it there, but it's the RIC and the DMP. I think it's about 450. I was very surprised at the high figure for the British military. It's nearly as much as the police figures. And the IRA, over 500. And as usual in these conflicts, the civilians take the brunt of, or make up the brunt of the casualties. Back to the beginning, villains or victims. I think it's safe to say that the so-called special reinforcements foisted on the RIC in 1920 and 21 were villains. Neither the Black and Tans nor the Auxiliaries were policemen, and they never pretended to be policemen. They operated outside the law and at times quite brutally. The old RIC, if I can call them that, and although they were a colonial police force, they were 80% Irish and 80% Catholic, and it would appear to have been accepted by most people as a legitimate police force. The utilising of the constabulary in evictions has left an unfortunate, and I think possibly exaggerated, stain on its history. In the War of Independence, they were victims of the decision by Westminster to put them in the front line of fire against the IRA, and were also victims of Dáil Éireann, making them legitimate targets. There were bad apples in the force. The murder of Thomas McCurtain, the Republican Lord Mayor of Cork, in March 1920 was undoubtedly carried out by the RIC, not by the Black and Tans, not by the Auxiliaries. The RIC on many occasions engaged in the shooting up of towns, usually in response to some of their members being killed. The towns of Thurles and Gort in particular were very badly shot up by the RIC following the deaths of colleagues. Sergeant Eugene Igo was a sergeant in the west of Ireland, and he was talent spotted by Dublin Castle and brought up to Dublin and promoted and put in charge of a gang of like-minded individuals. The gang was called the Igo Gang. They patrolled the streets of Dublin dressed in civilian attire, keeping an eye out for Republicans who would be visiting from rural Ireland. And many Republicans were arrested and jailed by the IGO gang. The IRA made a number of attempts to get IGO, unsuccessful attempts, and he retired in 1922 and disappeared. Many men in the RIC would have been nationally minded, but constitutional nationalism rather than militant, because of the position that they held. Many also provided assistance to the IRA during the War of Independence, and a high number resigned for various reasons, but including support for Sinn Féin and a reluctance to enforce conscription. And finally, I think understandably few, if any, Irish people would support commemorating the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries. But can there be a selective commemoration of the force? Should it be commemorated or in its entirety or not at all? I'll just leave that hanging there, and I'll finish up. Thank you very much for your attention.